In this episode of Vox, I will be talking about a wartime period in America's history, which spanned from 1914 to 1918, World War I, and I'll be specifically focusing on America's involvement in the war. This was America's first involvement in a world war, and as a result, it began with a shaky start, but together with American allies, they were able to successfully win the war and prosper from it. This video will be divided into three phases to fully analyze the war: the pre-war conditions for America which caused the war to occur, the wartime itself, and the aftermath of the war, in order to get a full understanding of World War I. Each of these three elements will also be divided into an additional four factors: social, economic, military, and finally, the political situation at this time. So the first phase of World War I and America's involvement is the American pre-war phase, spanning from the 19th to early 20th century. And during this time, although America was not involved yet into the war, World War I began, and the United States aligned itself with allies and supported them through means of supply and ammunition. Among the allies, prominent enemies consisted of Germany, which will also be analyzed in terms of its relevance to America's decisions to enter the war zone. The social situation of America consisted of an influx of immigration, and amidst the Progressive Era. America in the 19th century was becoming widely urbanized as immigration increased, and according to the Library of Congress, more than 15 million immigrants arrived in the United States during this time. Tensions increased between native-born Americans and immigrants as a result. Immigrants predominantly worked in places like the steel and textile mills, slaughterhouses, railroads, and manufacturing. Many immigrants faced poverty and were paid less than workers. This massive influx of immigration will play a major role in supplying American allies throughout the war. There was also progression of the women's suffrage movement throughout this progressive era. The women's suffrage movement began in the 1840s, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as well as Susan B. Anthony, were prominent members. While women were once seen only fit in domestic affairs, their roles were starting to be progressed and redefined as the movement spread. The Women's Rights Convention in 1848 was where the Declaration of Sentiments was signed, a piece stating women's equality to men and their right to vote. This marked the first phase of feminism, which would extend to the end of the war. Women became prominent members and patriots in the war effort, as will be discussed later in the video. Now let's move on to the economic element of this pre-war phase. So first let's take a look at Germany's economy. So since Germany was among the enemies of America and its allies which included Britain, Britain enacted a naval blockade against Germany enacted in 1914. This restricted maritime supply of goods, and according to National Archives, German imports had fallen a high 55%, which caused shortages in raw materials like coal, metals, and fertilizers for agriculture, ultimately immensely hurting Germany's economy and would play a major role when the United States enters the war. Now let's take a look at America's economy during this time. Before World War I started, the United States experienced an economic recession, but once the war began and America's European allies relied on trade with America, American exports would drastically increase, and as a result, its economy would flourish, being a prominent asset when America decides to enter the war. Now let's take a look at America's military during this phase. In 1913, 1 year before World War I, America took steps to prepare the country for potential war. The United States Army Chief Leonard Wood advocated for national defense and created experimental military instruction camps for college students in 1915. The Army had also expanded by adding a signal school in 1905, Field Artillery School in 1911, and School of Musketry in 1913. The National Defense Act of 1916 doubled the size of the Army, increased the National Guard, and gave President Wilson authority to mobilize the Guard in cases of emergency or war. Now let's take a look at the political element during this phase. So focusing on the war politics, it's important to know the allies for both the United States and Germany to fully understand the war itself. The United States allies were Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and Russia. The allies for Germany were Austria, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. So the entire World War started after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria by a Serbian nationalist group on June 28, 1914. They did this because Austria had control over their Serbian land. And this led to Austria declaring war on Serbia exactly 1 month later. Following this declaration, Russia then began to mobilize alongside Serbia. Then Germany followed and declared war on Russia, supporting Austria, in August of 1914. In terms of American politics during this time, it's consisted of the Progressive Era, mentioned earlier, which advocated for industrial reforms, women's suffrage reforms, Black activism, economic and environmental advocacy. More heavily regarded during this time is the political atmosphere and tensions of a war occurring abroad and America's place on the war board. So to understand this, it's important to analyze the nation's leadership during this time. The nation's World War I leader was President Wilson, who was a Democrat and started his presidency from 1913 till 1921. In addition to being a leader of World War I, he was also the leader during the Progressive Era. Wilson's stance on the war was isolationism. He believed that it was in the country's best interests that America stay neutral and not involve itself in a European affair. And this may also be because of his fear of not winning re-election and fear of the war's devastating outcomes and the blame which he feared would go under his and his administration's name. The majority of the public opinion, including Democrats during this time, agreed with Wilson's neutrality since it was well aware to the American people that any war would have deadly and devastating outcomes. With these values in mind, during President Wilson's message to Congress in 1914, he stated how every man who really loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality, which is a spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned. However, the death and maritime warfare, which would target America in 1915, would alter America's isolationism, leaving an unerasable scar which would shake reality. Before and leading up to this time, Germany would often use their newly enforced undersea boats to Britain and to resist the British naval blockade, which deeply hurt their economy. Germany, as a result, wanted to end the war as soon as possible, and so they attacked merchant and military ships and killing many, many civilians. On May 7, 1915, a U.S. ship, Lusitania, was attacked by a German ship. The German embassy in the United States announced that this ship would be attacked for all the resources that were in it, such as ammunition. They took full control over the boat and killed 1,200 Americans. After pressures from government officials who believed that America must defend the Allied forces to create a stronger defense, Wilson created a preparedness campaign. The Civilian Council of National Defense was formed by Wilson on August 24, 1916, during the war to coordinate and supply resources. They worked on a range of fields such as transportation, social world, and economics. The campaign also consisted of doubling the size of the army and furthermore included the Naval Appropriations Act of 1916, which expanded U.S. ships and other naval-related defense. In addition to maritime attacks, economics is also one of the reasons that would slowly lead America out of neutrality. Britain was America's most important trading partner, and allies relied on American goods since the war started. The British naval blockade caused British export to end, which hurt British economy, and as a result, the United States private banks made high amounts of loans to Britain. So the final push for war was the Zimmermann Telegram. In January of 1917, the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a telegram to Mexican leadership. And in this telegram, it it mainly consisted of an active secretive diplomatic alliance. The German minister intended for Mexico's support if the United States entered the war, and in return, Mexico would have a chance to take back its land from the United States, lost during the Mexican-American Wars. And Germany would receive extra protection in regards to its military, and Mexico would have a potential chance in gaining back its land from the United States. This was later rejected by the Mexican government because of the weakness of the alliance. And Germany would not be able to provide a strong military force as Germany's forces were being blockaded by the British Navy. In addition, Mexico was under multiple civil wars within its own nation, so it would not be stable to go into war against America while facing violence from the public. So because of the Civil War, Mexico's economy was also unstable, which resulted in Mexico not being able to afford a major war like World War I. So this telegram was intercepted by the United States, and when it did, America's response caused a political stir. A majority of the public shifted from respecting neutrality of the United States to pressuring for war against Germany. And in addition, it soon contributed to the United States entering war after ill relations with Germany. And with all these issues being stacked upon each other, the public sitting on the edge of their seats and Wilson facing political turmoil, America would soon enter the war on April 6, 1917, after April 2nd, 1917, where President Wilson urged Congress in a joint session for a declaration of war. So Wilson realized that it was not possible for the United States to remain a stable and secure neutrality during this time. Germany was already acting in offense and maritime violence, which obstructed American trade and neutrality. He believed that it was time America enter the stage of the World War and declare it be a war to end war, to spread democracy and protect the nation from monarchies, and, quote, to make the world safe for democracy. So this leads us to the next phase of America's involvement in World War I from 1917 to 1918. The social element during this time in America consisted of government involvement in reducing the backlash against the war, and the involvement of women and Black people in the war effort. So many Americans supported Wilson's neutrality in the beginning of World War I, but did not fully support his decision when the United States entered the war because of its loss of life and overall damaging effects. And that's why the Committee on Public Information, also known as the CPI, was created. So this committee was led by journalist George Creel, with the purpose to persuade the public opinion in support of the war and Wilson's presidency. President Wilson established this committee in April of 1917 to encourage the public to participate and serve in the war, and aiming to create peace within the nation itself by lessening internal conflicts caused by radical public opinion. So they did this by publishing posters, billboards, pamphlets, and more. And during this time, there was also waves of patriotism that spread on political posters, ads, and songs, which encouraged Americans to serve and join the fight. And many Americans also volunteered for military service and provided aid for soldiers. And for example, women played a major role during this time in serving their country. They began to work in factories and other jobs which men had left behind while they were serving in the army. And after the support Wilson received from the women's suffrage movement on his decision to enter the war, as well as the contributions of the war effort, Wilson endorsed women's suffrage. So some of the women's suffrage organizations that are important to know are the National Women's Party, NASA, and the National League for Women's Services. National Women's Party was founded by Alice Paul, who believed in anti-violence and did not agree with America going into the war. And she, along with her supporters, protested the war by performing hunger strikes and marches. They were, however, the minority in opinion within the entire women's suffrage movement. NASA was founded by Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They supported World War I